When you start doing something really new, like Henry Ford was doing when building his Model T, it's only natural and, in fact, expected that you're going to run into all kinds of different problems. But instead of giving in to the very natural urge to scale back and reduce your ambition, what if the right approach was to change more? Last week, we wrote an article about how in the 1900s, electric vehicles were quite prevalent and they had all the conditions necessary to become the dominant mode of transport. But in the end, they retreated into obsolescence, and instead, Ford's Model T ended up dominating the roads. We argue that's because the electric vehicle, as revolutionary as the technology itself might have been, failed to change anything else in the mobility system that existed around the vehicle. Ford's Model T, on the other hand, changed everything. In today's episode, we get into some interesting discussions, including how there might be a second mover advantage to change, how scale is overrated, and how when you're trying to do something radically new, there might be no right or wrong. So let's get into it. So I think the first question we had was the fact that electric vehicles had everything going for it in the beginning. There was investment, there was momentum. And even Ford himself had actually invested a significant amount of money in trying to make the electric vehicle work. But eventually, of course, we know, as we've also written about in the article, Ford Model T worked much better and was the one that dominated. But often, it also happened a little bit organically where Ford didn't change everything all at once. It sort of happened little by little. In that case, is a first mover advantage, that the electric vehicle had like a 20-year head start. Is the first mover advantage even a thing when you're thinking about radical change, when you're thinking about changing an entire reality?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I think for the Ford versus Rolls-Royce thing, Ford built his machine to make machines. That is a scaling capability that obviously helps. I think if you are far ahead of your time, of course, your road is difficult because nobody will understand you. If you're late, yeah, then the market is already there. Everybody will understand you because it's clear what you're doing. But others are there already, so to gain a position might be difficult. I think in terms of coming up with a new reality in a sort of clean situation where you can do whatever you want to do. If it's a contested situation with a lot of players doing a lot of things, I think that is not to your advantage. Yes? The really new stuff, I think if you really want to be able to think about something really new, I think it's best to be early. But the problem with that is nobody will understand because it's not current. It's not, on topic. It's ahead of its time. If you want to be in sync with the moment so that people understand what you're saying, yeah, then there will be others doing similar or alternate things that are related, and that makes it more difficult. You become constrained by other ideas. So in terms of course, I like to think of myself as a free thinker. It's better to look at areas where there is nobody. But the problem is there's nobody. Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
problem.
You have to
Yeah,
choose your problem, really.
yeah,
If there's nobody, you will have to choose the problem of trying to explain it to people who might never really understand it until it becomes
yeah,
some sort of
Yeah.
visible reality. And otherwise, you have to choose the problem of trying to find a voice when everybody is trying to do something because there is already a burning platform, a reason to
yeah,
look for a new reality.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that usually, if you look back, then it all seems so clear, right? But I certainly believe that luck and being there at the right moment in time,
Yeah,
having the right people
yeah,
around you, having the capabilities to invest in the right things, it's so important. And in that sense, it does help, of course, if it's new, but not that new that you're the only one. So if you can learn from the mistakes of others, of course, that can also help. So timing is so important,
Yeah.
right? So and you just don't know until you start it and you work hard and you bump your nose again and again, and then it helps. But that's the other topic, to have a kind of beacon that at least guides your own endeavors in
Yeah, yeah.
situation where yeah, everything is emerging.
Yeah, so I think I agree on that. I think timing is probably more important than being early or late, but the real issue is timing. So I do think, let's say, in the things that as an entrepreneur I have done, is if you have an idea and you stick with it, the moment for it will come. But the problem is, at one point you either run out of money or steam. Yeah, it's very difficult. But still, I like to be early.
Because
Yeah,
you could argue that the EV was a little bit ahead of its time just a few years later. I don't know, the road network played a big role in the combustion engine vehicle becoming as big as it did, because then not only was the vehicle itself able to go longer distances, but the infrastructure to go longer distances was also there because the roads got better. That was just not there at the time of the EV. So maybe had that one thing been different, perhaps EVs would have been the main mode of transport for the
yeah,
last 50 years.
yeah, could be. Yeah,
Yeah. And then there's this other thing that you talked about, luck, Yana. I think it's a good place to also talk a little bit about what you've always said of how do you make a little bit of luck in terms of being there and making small bets across multiple parts, because it reminds me of the fact that yes, Henry Ford is known for the Model T, but he also invested 1.5 million in the EV. So is there, like, could you articulate a little bit more of how can you influence your luck like that?
Of course, I don't know the answer, but to me, it seems from a statistical point of view, if you don't know where the world is heading or where reality is heading, and there are actually multiple pathways, even simultaneously, I think that was the nice insight from the Rolls Royce versus the Model T. Then it's wise to have those experiments in a lot of different ways, and you learn a lot from that, right? So then the goal is not to succeed per se, but it's about learning and testing. And in that sense, of course, everybody's talking in startup on MVPs. So that's of course it's logical to do that. But then you would want to have multiple MPVs and have parallel iterations there. And that's and then yeah, what we believe obviously is our framework could help out there. Huh? So you could imagine that if you're really fond of combustion engines, that indeed you try both. You try, well, not only those two that we now, in hindsight, know that were successful, but you try a lot of them with all sorts of inversions, really at the highest level of the system. And of course, you need to have the money and the time and the people around you to do that. But still, I do believe that there's a way to place those bets wisely.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
And of course, the then and that's the key message of the article. You should not shy away from changing more and more and more. Yeah, and first mover also. I don't know.
yeah,
I think we are heavily biased by
yeah,
our hindsight knowledge, because I think you actually found out, Mansi, that there were loads and loads of automobile producing companies around, huh?
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah. And Mansi, something that came to my mind while we were discussing. I think first mover is, there's also the danger that you make, let's say, silly mistakes, huh? Because it hasn't been done before. And so maybe being a second mover, you can learn from the mistakes of the tired first mover. Huh? So I think that is maybe something as well. So if you can learn, yeah, it's also always easier than to make the path. It's more difficult. Yeah, there are serious drawbacks to a first mover. Again, if you really want to be able to really design everything, is probably still the best, but I think it has a bad name. So for instance, when I was working at Philips in research, they sort of had a rule, and they say you could think about things for new products in existing, existing products in existing markets, then new products in existing markets, then new. Okay, but you get it. And then there is they call it the corner of death, where everything is new.
So Erik is talking about the Ansoff matrix, where the axes are products and markets, and there are two categories, new and existing, on both axes. That divides the mapping area into four distinct quadrants: existing products and existing markets, existing products and new markets, new products in existing markets, and new products in new markets. We're going to be spending time talking about that last quadrant of new products in new markets.
So it has a super negative name,
Yeah.
the corner of death. But it's so interesting because Philips came out of the corner of death. I mean, that's where they came from, but they rejected it so firmly. And then nothing ever happened after that. So to me, it's very strange. And I would like to make the case for the corner of death. I think this is where there is space to design.
Yeah, it's so funny you talk about that because just today I was going through a very dated example of Fujifilm and trying to go into what they did differently, of course, than Kodak. And indeed, literally, the CEO told the R&D team to, over a period of 1.5 years, audit all of the technologies that they had in-house and map them according to current technologies that can be used in current markets, and then
Yeah,
also similar
yeah,
matrix,
yeah,
and then actually placed significant bets on indeed the quadrant of death,
yeah.
on the new technologies that are in new emerging sort of markets. And I think it was the LCD display one that was a big bet. It wasn't sure whether this would work out or the market would emerge the way they had projected, but they placed a bet on it, and it worked. And of course, they made similar bets in pharmaceuticals and cosmetics and many others. So, funnily enough, the quadrant of death is actually the quadrant of life if
Of
you were to
course.
explore
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But then indeed, like you say yourself, then you
Yeah.
don't want one bet, huh? You want many bets.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's just risking
Yeah.
your company. And you can
Yeah.
do that if you're a startup and you're small and the risk is basically only on
Yeah.
your own. But if you're a CEO of a big company and there's shareholders, that's really difficult. But still then it's also it's yeah, so you should have many and then still you should be a bit lucky with your timing, I guess. Yeah, Erik, you were mentioning also in Philips would have this music recognition that later, of course, Shazam is well known now. And that was also to me an example of timing, right? So the technology was there, you had it in Philips, but yeah,
Ah,
Shazam got it right in terms of timing.
yeah. But okay. Yeah. But there is another angle to that story as well, which relates to timing. So we in Philips, some researchers came up with the idea to build music recognition, and they figured out how to do it, and they got it working, and it got to, I think, a reporter of the New York Times. He wrote about it. Then they got all kinds of calls from the music industry. At the time, I was hired to look at that.
When was that? Which year are we talking about, Erik?
I think 2001. And okay, so I took the job and I started, and then we ran into a patent issue with Shazam. They existed already, and it was so funny because Shazam had, in my recollection, they had a huge investment, like tens of millions of euros. They had Linux, Wolfram clusters. I mean, we were so jealous on the stuff that they had. We had a silly second grade bullshit server running, it was terrible. But our investment was almost nothing. in comparison. I think not even 1% of theirs. And then we struck a deal with Nielsen to monitor the Billboard Hot 100, and we got it into some mobile phones. Sony was using it. Okay, so it took off, and then we were laughing at Shazam because we said, the idiots, they spend so much money. Their system is terrible because it worked a lot less well than our system. We could prove it by just, trying it. We had the deals, we had the money, and they only had the investment. Then nothing happened for, I don't know, let's say 10 years, 15 years. And then I read an article that it was sold to Apple for few €100 million, whereas we at one point sold it to Gracenote for several tens of millions. And so when we sold it to Gracenote, first I was happy because we were outperforming them in the market. Second, we sold it to Gracenote for several tens of millions. I was even more sort of feeling, like we beat those guys. And then they sold it for at least 20 times more. They sold their stuff to Apple. So this brings me to the point of timing. And it is, I think, a perfect example of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China saying, when he was asked about the French Revolution, how he felt about it. He said, it's too early to tell.
For listeners that are a little confused by the sudden and random digression into a quote from the Chinese foreign minister, Erik is actually talking about a famous quote from the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai back in 1972 when he was asked about the impact of the French Revolution when he said it was too early to say. This quote flew around the West as evidence of the fact that the Chinese take a very long view of the world and they were a patient civilization. However, later it was found out that this was miscommunication, and the Chinese premier was actually talking about a civil uprising in 1968 in France, which shut the country down for a few weeks.
When he was asked about the French Revolution, how he felt about it, he said, it's too early to tell. And it is too early to tell. So when are you going to look back? And this is a fundamental thing about drastic things. When do you take the moment to look back and make an assessment? And actually, any answer can be your answer. And nobody wants to hear this, but it's true. So if you look at it now, what was it? Yeah, I mean, was it a good idea to have your kids? I mean, if they are misbehaving, it was a terrible idea. 10 years later, they are married themselves, they have kids. It's great. It was the best thing ever. It depends when you look at it. And it's super difficult. It's super difficult and super dangerous to reach conclusions. So about timing, I think I have been tricked by it because the Shazam guys, they beat us big time. That's how I see it right now.
Yeah, I think that the other point that you always make, Erik, about drastic change, that it looks like drastic change happens in one fell swoop, but it doesn't.
No.
It always happens gradually. And indeed, it depends how it looks to you, depends on which part of that timeline you're looking back from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Legislation of drugs in Netherlands, was it a good idea or a bad idea?
Yeah.
For a long time, I thought it was a really great idea. Now I'm starting to think it was an ultra stupid idea. But I mean, that's what I'm thinking now. How will it be in 20 years? It's difficult to say. I don't know. You have to be careful.
She triggered me with the Philips versus the Shazam story. I mean, yeah, I don't want to sound like it doesn't really matter how big time you win, but still, if Shazam wouldn't have been there, then the story would be quite a success, right? I mean, Philips inventing some algorithm to recognize music, sell it to these big companies.
Yeah.
That's in that sense that's a good story. And then only if you compare it, and then comparing
it becomes bad.
Back,
yeah,
then it becomes bad.
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So that's what I mean with perspective. Yeah.
So but then if you take that into account, if you think about how the future will unfold, then you're on a certain path, obviously, and you don't know where you will end up. But there's still lots of opportunities to steer in the right direction.
Yeah.
Okay, and speaking of right direction, I think that's one of the bigger concepts that we've brought out in the article is the concept of the beacon and the fact that Ford had a very clear beacon, and it was quite unique at that time, at least at a time when just any vehicle was mostly only in the reach of aristocrats and really rich people. He had the beacon of affordability. The across the Atlantic, you had Henry Royce following a different beacon of performance and perfection in the form of the Rolls Royce. How do you choose that beacon? Because apparently, when everything else is cloudy, that's the only thing that's going to the only thing that's going to give you direction and help you understand which direction to steer in. So, what can we say about choosing that beacon?
I mean, there's a lot of talk about leadership. I think a lot of bullshit about leadership. But the if you have a good beacon essence, then the leader is actually also a follower, and it's really easy for everybody to be a follower.
Mhm.
So and then of course you still need leaders. Well, maybe no, but it makes it easy for all people to follow. That's and I mean you see it everywhere. So the first thing that comes to mind is the heroic deeds of the Ukrainian people. Yeah, there's this. It's the beacon is stay a nation and stay autonomous, and then it's also to me. I think it's quite easy to be a leader because the leader itself is a follower.
Mm,
I like that. Yeah.
yeah.
So my answer would be, it's not a generic answer, of course, Matsi, but I think if there is a don't care that for some reason has scaled into a do care, then there is this always has to do with market. So then the market for something is big. And then in this big market, something that was non-important because of the scale of the market became important and it has to be fixed. Then the market for the fix, let's say, because the market is big, because of the scale, is a big market. So
For those listeners who got a little bit confused with the last part that Erik was talking about, we'll start with the concept of a don't care. The don't care is a concept from our book, If Not This Then What, and it is used to describe something that was insignificantly small when the system was first designed, but as the system scales or as time passes, it accumulates. And as it accumulates, that don't care can invert into a do care, something that forces a change in the system, in fact, forces the entire system to change. And so, what Erik means is when a don't care inverts to a do care, it is likely the result of the scaling of a big problem, which means that the market for the solution of this big problem is likely to be very big as well. And that's why a don't care is a good place to start looking for your beacon essence.
I think a very nice beacon is the inverted don't care. So what I like to do is, if people give me some topic, I'm looking for the don't care, and I'm continuously all the time thinking, okay, so this could be a don't care. What if it could scale? Does it scale already? Do they have, do they understand this? And then if you can find a don't care that is scaling into a situation of problematic, then let's say for a solution, if you can find it, there could be a large market. So I like that one as a suggestion for a good beacon. Yeah,
I don't know if the EVs would have scaled at that time, then maybe we would have still really difficult other problems. So
probably.
who knows? That's again the
And so also but this is a good point. I think let's say, take any solution and scale it to 6 billion people,
Yeah.
all using that is a problem.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not optimistic. I have to say the whole trend in the industry to make these huge companies and standardize on everything, and it's just a bad idea, because then the problematic aspects of those few things will be amplified so much that whatever don't cares are there, how infinitesimally small, they will still become do cares, and it makes many things problematic. So it's much better to have small companies with many more products that solve things in different ways to alleviate these don't care, so that they stay don't care.
Yeah,
Sorry
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
That's the kind of diversity and
Argument. Yeah,
robustness and of course
yeah, exactly.
the anti-fragility and all that kind of stuff. But that's just not in our economic system.
No,
It's all that people talk about and that people want is scale.
a scale. Yeah, I mean, what do you want? You want a scale up. Everybody's after a scale up, but a scale up is making don't cares do cares. That's the only thing it does in the end.
Yeah,
Yeah. Of
Yeah, so
course.
there's another anti-monopoly argument outside of just, oh, increased competition is good for the consumer. It also is good for these externalities that we call don't cares. They won't scale alongside the scale of the company if
Yeah.
you
Of
keep them
course.
small. Okay. I do like the idea. I've been thinking for a long time since we've started writing these articles. The fact that the word radical has a negative connotation and therefore radical change has a negative connotation. Similarly, I think scale indeed has too much of a positive connotation and not balanced out by the fact that scale almost always leads to problems. Not
Yeah,
almost always, always does lead to
yeah,
problems. And it should also carry with it a negative connotation, at least to bring emphasis on some of these problems that we're just too programmed to ignore.
yeah,
Okay.
right.
There is, of course, this question of how do you know it's right? So, we've talked about, in the article at least, we've talked about the fact that Ford and Henry Royce were both working on two very different realities, and both of them found a spot in the new reality. So, what does this say about being right? Because often I think when companies, any organization, any change maker is trying to assess what kind of change needs to be made, there's always this fear, is it the right choice, and how should we think about a right reality or being right, perhaps?
For me, it's again, it's not about right. It's
Mm.
you maximize your chances of something coherent and consistent if you make it very different from the current reality, and you can do that in many ways. And then if you are not there yet, there's
Mm.
problems, it's not working, then the answer is to change more because that and we could make that a mathematical statistical argument, I think. And if you change more, then you open up a bigger solution space, and somewhere in the solution space, you have a spot on your own. Yeah, how big will it be? We talked about indeed. Ford was more successful than Royce, maybe. Shazam was more successful than the Philips invention. So you don't. So in that sense, right? You don't know. Low chance to being right, but you will get something right. I think
Mm.
that's the thing. I just
Mm. And so, could you say that coherence is what will get you right? Coherence is much more important than being right, because right is just existing and coexisting with multiple other versions of a reality that others are pursuing. But as if you can pursue coherence, then that is being right.
yes, I would say so. But coherent means that you should be willing to consider for every essence a radical change,
Yeah,
because then your chances of getting it coherent are just way
are
higher.
higher.
yeah.
Yeah. A quick side note on the concept of coherence, because we haven't covered this in any of our previous podcasts or in the article itself. Coherence essentially refers to the compatibility of the different changes that you're implementing in the system. In keeping with the theme of the article and the podcast, if you consider a car, every part of the car needs to work with each other. Otherwise, the automobile itself falls apart. It does not work. Similarly, when you are changing something in the car, like perhaps upgrading the engine, chances are you're going to have to change many other things in the car as well to make it compatible and coherent with the new change that you want to incorporate. And that's the property that we call coherence.
I think the proper way to think about this is as ever changing. So if you go for a drastic change, then the only way to think to perceive it is in retrospect. This can be at any time. There will be any answer. So I think it is to your advantage to not to stick to a single thing and believe that that will be right for all time, because by definition, I will guarantee you this will not play out. It will not always be good. So in that sense, there just is no right, there is no wrong. There is a moment in time where you perceive it with its benefits, with its problems, at its current scale, and in that mix there is an opinion. You can call it good, you can call it bad, I don't know. In several years that will change. So the whole question of right and wrong and true or not true, for me is a non-question.
Yeah. Yeah. What you've kind of ended up describing is essentially we look at the peak that we want to climb as the static thing. But as soon as you start taking the
Yeah,
first step, the peak itself changes. And so
yeah,
there can be no right. With every step, the peak will change and you can reach a peak, and in the very next, moment, whether that's a year, whether that's 10, that peak will no longer be the peak. It will be a
yeah.
valley. I think there's a word for it, isn't it, in complexity theory?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I hope there is. I hope there is. Oh, that's the cat.
So, with the arrival of Erik's cat, we'll leave this episode right here. And for listeners who are curious, there is indeed a term for this in complexity theory. We looked it up later. It's called complex adaptive systems, or the more memorable dancing landscapes, which refers to rapidly changing interdependent environments where the optimal solution, or the peak, moves in response to actions of independent actors. We'll get into many more conversations like these in the following episodes, but for now, we'll see you again in 2 weeks.